Hello, and thanks for joining us on another edition of Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks, and as a lifelong magazine reader, I'm particularly pleased to have Graydon Carter as our guest on this episode. Born in Toronto and raised in Ottawa, Graydon has been a magazine founder, editor, and writer for his entire career, most notably as the editor of the wildly popular Vanity Fair for roughly 25 years until 2017. But instead of retiring then, he launched a brand new weekly online magazine called Airmail, which we will talk about. Graydon Carter, thanks so much for joining us here on Canada Files.
Very nice to be here, Jim.
Well, let's start, not surprisingly, at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your background in Canada before university, because as famous as you are, I don't think there's a lot of people that know much about your early years.
It's pretty simple. I grew up in Ottawa. My father worked for the government. My mother was a Sunday painter. And I grew up, playing hockey and touch football. I went to the university, and I was at the University of Ottawa, and all of a sudden I noticed a bunch of young guys in an office there, and I poked my head in, and they said they were starting a magazine, and it was called the Canadian Review, and it was a political literary magazine. But my life had been, Ottawa's it's frozen for a good part of the year, at least it was in those days. And my life was reading. I'd read everything. We subscribed to Esquire and Newsweek and Time and Life. And the thing about newspapers is they tell you about the events of the day, but magazines tell you about worlds outside yours. And so many of the magazines that we subscribed to were New York-based publications. So much of what I dreamt about, what I might do, came from magazines. And at some point I thought, when I saw these two guys starting a magazine, I asked if they could use some help. They needed help as an art director, so I said, I'll be the art director. So I painted a bit, so I was the art director for a while, then I became the co-editor. And it's funny, I eventually got thrown out of school for skipping. I skipped 90% of my classes because this became all-consuming. And I know you go to university to find out what you want to do in life, and I did, but just in a very unorthodox way. So when they asked me to, they said, there's simply no point in you continuing. You have too many incompletes to ever graduate. So I left and worked full-time on this magazine. And it like all small magazines, eventually it ran on the shoals of near bankruptcy, and we sold it to Saturday Night Magazine. And then I didn't have a job, and I was sharing a house in the Gatineau with a friend of mine, and she noticed an ad for an editing program in just outside New York. And so I wrote to them, and I went to this program, and they had brought in a lot of editors from New York. Editors of Time, editors from Saturday Review, from Foreign Affairs, from Harper's. And so I got to meet all these editors at this program, and I wrote to them all afterwards. And I went in, I came back a month after the course was over. I had a number of interviews lined up. And so in those days, you still get off a plane from Canada, and you got onto the tarmac rather than being airlifted into the air hub. And I didn't own a suit. I had a Harris tweed jacket that was about a half an inch thick. I arrived in the middle of July in New York. The door opened of the plane. I've never felt heat like this in my life. And I had an interview with Louis Lapham, who was the editor of Harper's, that day. So I got a cab in from the airport. I had a small bag with me. I was perspiring like Albert Brooks on broadcast news. So I popped into this old hotel. It's gone now. It was the Sheraton Russell on Lower Park Avenue, and went to the men's room and sort of sponge bathed me because I was just drenched. So I went in to have an interview with Louis, and he said, like, I'm really sorry, we don't have a job for you. He said, like, I got to go somewhere, and but I think you should just sit in front of the air conditioning here for a while and cool off. So I ended that week. My last interview was with Ray Cave, who was the editor of Time magazine. And Time was then really the place to be. It was it had a vast masthead, and I thought it would be a good place for me. And on that last day, I was offered a job. So I came back, I picked up my stuff, drove down to New York, and started at Time, and it was a life-changing experience.
Well, you've just answered my first 4 questions. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. That's a very good brief history of the early years of Graydon Carter. So let's skip ahead. You actually spent about 5 years ultimately at Time Life, and then you and Kurt Anderson and another partner started Spy magazine in, about 1986. Were you and those other gentlemen just cynical young men, or did you actually see a good business opportunity with a satirical magazine?
No, first of all, no, we were not. We were both slightly cynical and really bad at business. And I'd spent 5 years at Time, and then I went to Life magazine, and I was able to get my work done in about first 3 hours of every week. So I would set up my office, and Kurt would come up, and we'd work on a business plan for, he was on Time magazine, there were a few floors below. And then a friend, Tom Phillips, who worked at the Rothschild Bank, he'd come over and he had the old-fashioned Macintosh. It was about this tall, and he would set up on my desk, and we'd have meetings there for like 7 hours every day. And just
on the Life payroll.
On the Life payroll, on the editors and writers corridor. And we even got the printing facility in the building to print up our prospectus for Spy. But I was in New York by that time about 8 years, and I sort of knew enough and didn't care enough about burning bridges. And I was like in my mid-30s, and it was a good time. New York was exploding. It had come out of a really bad recession. There were a lot of characters with tons of money flowing around. It was like a vast, colorful circus. And so many of the magazines were sort of lapdogs to this new class of rich New Yorkers. And, but we decided to go the other way. And we raised the money, and from the funny thing is we raised the money from the most established financial people, Coca-Cola heirs, Safeway supermarket heirs, E.F. Hutton heirs, the Washington Post heir. And so it was old money with a new idea.
Well, let's skip further ahead because there's so much to cover. After those years, in 1992, you had left Spy by then, and you were invited to take over the editor's desk at Vanity Fair. Was this the best thing that ever happened to you in your life at that point, or were you absolutely petrified at taking over such a huge opportunity with a major publication?
Well, first I wanted, after I left, we sold Spy to Charles Saatchi, the advertising king in England, and Johnny Pagazzi, who's sort of an investor playboy around the world. And I left, I worked on a newspaper. I turned around this newspaper called the New York Observer, which had been a sort of slightly sleepy Upper East Side paper, and I turned it into something that people actually started to read. And I'd met Cy a number of times before. At one point he wanted to buy Spy, and foolishly we didn't sell it to him. Cy Newhouse, who is the proprietor of Condé Nast, which owns Vanity Fair, Vogue, The New Yorker, and he asked if I'd come by and see him. So I came by after work. I wasn't sure what it was about. In fact, I just picked up a fishing rod from Orvis, and I think I had shorts on. Anyway, I go, and he doesn't care. He's a very casual fellow. So I go to his apartment at the UN Towers, and we're sitting there making pleasant industry chit-chat. And he said, look, I've got 2 magazines for you. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I've got 2 magazines. I've got The New Yorker and Vanity Fair. Would you be interested in one of them? I went, oh, are you kidding me? So
sure.
We had done nothing but make fun of Vanity Fair for the last 5 years at Spy. And we'd read The New Yorker my entire life. And so I said, The New Yorker. He said, okay. So we agreed on a salary, and he said, you can't tell anybody for 2 weeks. I said, okay. So for 2 weeks, I worked on a plan of how to make subtle changes over a 6-month period, 8-month period, or 9-month period, in an 18-month period. And I could talk to my family about it, but we had a code name for it. We called it the pencils, in case we were at a restaurant and anybody overheard us, that they wouldn't know what we were talking about. So this went on for 2 weeks, and the day it was supposed to be announced, I get a call from Anna Wintour, who said, it's going to be the other magazine. I said, what do you mean? She said, Sai's going to offer you the other magazine. He's going to call you in a few minutes, act surprised. So Sai calls a few minutes later and offers me Vanity Fair, and I desperately needed the money. I had 3 kids with a 4th on the way, and I never made a lot of money at Spy, and I didn't make any money at the New York Observer. So I was very interested in, I said, yes, of course, I'll take this one. And I had to start the next Monday. The staff hated me at first because we had made fun of the magazine for 5 years. So the first 2 years at Vanity Fair were incredibly rocky. But then it turned around. And then I got rid of, I only fired 3 people in 25 years there. I fired them all on the same day. And I got rid of them. And then all of a sudden it was like Miss Havisham's. The curtains opened, the sunshine came in, and I felt safe to bring my children into the office at that point, because I wouldn't let them into the office before that, because it was a poisonous, horrible atmosphere.
Did you ever have any sleepless nights, though, knowing that the magazine was going to hit the newsstand the next day and there might be a very harsh or even questionable article about somebody, and you were worried about the impact and possible lawsuits that might be coming against you or the magazine?
We had 2 major lawsuits, both of which were in London, which is sort of the Liberia of libel actions. And but those I did not see coming. I do remember when we figured out who Deep Throat was, and this is a story that took us 2.5 years of work. And I was leaving on my honeymoon. We weren't 100% sure that we had the story correct. And this is a period during the Bush administration where, as a journalist, if you got a story wrong, you were in big trouble. I could have called 2 people to just to finalize it. I could have called Carl Bernstein, who was on our masthead, or I could have called Bob Woodward. I figured if I called Carl, he'd call Bob. If I called Bob, he'd jump the gun and put it in the Washington Post. And this is pre-internet, so we had a secret room to close this story. We had one fact checker on the story, 1 copy editor on the story. We had to photograph Mark Felt in secrecy, and we had to get it into the magazine. We had to get it to the printer. We had to print it, and we had to ship it across the country, all of which took about 15 days once it left the printer. And you were praying that everybody would maintain the secrecy on this. We tried not to make a big deal of it. Anyway, we did this. I go away on my honeymoon, and my wife and I were in the airport in Nassau in the Bahamas on the way back, and I didn't even have a cell phone in those days. And she had one of those old flip phones, and she gets a call, and it's from the editor who worked on the story, David Frenny. He says, we're releasing the Deep Throat story today. I said, oh my God, I completely forgot about this. He said, yeah. So I said, I'll let you know what happens. So there'd been a delay with the plane, and we were sitting in the terminal. He calls back and says, we released it. Woodward and Bernstein are going to make an announcement in a half an hour. I said, Jesus, David, I got to get on this plane in 20 minutes. And so they started calling for the boarding, and people started lining up, and I kept delaying it as long as humanly possible until we got a call back from New York. And I was just praying that the answer would be the one we wanted. And so finally, just as we're getting to the gate, we get the call, and he says, Woodward and Bernstein just confirmed that it was Deep Throat. And that wasn't stressful as I went to bed, but it was like, for that 40-minute period, it was about as stressful as it got at the whole time at Vanity Fair. And it was on every front page of every newspaper in the world the next day.
Was that the proudest story you ever ran? I mean, for you personally?
No, there's a million stories. It's funny the things you remember. There's a story we did about, it's a crazy story. It was about people they're called plushies and furries. And they're people who like to dress up in in furry animal costumes, and they have conventions and that sort of thing. And I think it was done by this guy, George Gurley, who's a really funny writer. And it was the nuttiest story I'd ever read. And they have sex with these things on, and they meet each other at conventions. They're all dressed like, Scooby-Doo and like, large bunny rabbits. And if for some reason, if I had to name one story that I remember above all at Vanity Fair, and I published like 5,000 stories, that would be it.
All right, you spent 25 years as the editor of Vanity Fair and built a huge profile for yourself. Why did you leave?
I lived through the golden age of magazines, and I think Vanity Fair was at the pinnacle of that. My staff and we had the most ridiculously wonderful life, and we worked hard, and we're all still friends, and it was a great 25-year run, but it was exhausting for me by the end. Because when I started, I was like 42, and when I was done, I was like 68. Everything I'd done at Vanity Fair, I'd done. There's nowhere I could take it to. The magazine business was not in the greatest shape. Vanity Fair was still hugely profitable, and I wanted to leave it with it on top. And I wanted a change. It's, those jobs they're sort of fun. When you look back, they're tough. They take it out of you. I was editor through 8 presidents, probably 10 editors of time, like probably 5 editors of the New York Times during that period, maybe more than that. So it's a long time to be in one job.
One might have thought that you would retire at that point, but in fact, you rather quickly turned around and started Airmail. And let's talk about Airmail. It came out, as I said, 2 years after you retired, and it's a online subscription-only publication. I don't know if you call it a publication when you're not actually publishing.
We call it a digital weekly.
A digital weekly. And I have been a subscriber almost from the beginning, and I would say, and I suspect an awful lot of your readers of Airmail would agree, that it seems like you just picked up where you left off from Vanity Fair. The quality of the articles is outstanding, but is it a fair assessment to say that it's sort of an online version of Vanity Fair?
I mean, that's not the worst thing to say. There are elements, there's 3 of the staff members are from Spy magazine, so there's elements of Spy in there as well. And I'm an old dog, so I can't completely learn new tricks. And so, the Airmail has elements of Vanity Fair. It's a certain worldview, and but it's very international. It's probably 60% of the stories are from outside the United States. There was enough coverage of the sort of what we call the Acela corridor between, say Boston, New York, Washington. I wasn't going to get wrapped up in the box score keeping of what was going on in Washington at the time. We covered Trump. I wrote a lot about Trump, and but it was designed to survive a post-Trump era. And I think some publications will have trouble without Trump around. He was good for the media business. He provided copy, and the fact is, Biden is like a really competent administrator, and you don't check the paper in panic every morning. You just sort of check up on him and see what he's doing next, because it's like a refrigerator that works really well. You appreciate it, and keeps your milk cold, but you don't have to check it every 5 minutes.
One major difference between Vanity Fair and Airmail, of course, is the fact that Airmail is weekly, Vanity Fair is monthly. Was it a big adjustment for you to go from a monthly publication to perhaps a more frantic schedule of putting together a publication every week?
I'll be honest, and this may surprise most people who aren't in the magazine business, a monthly is much tougher than a weekly. Because a weekly, you sort of reflect a lot of what happened the week before. So a certain segment of your stories are quite current. A monthly, whether you're at Sports Illustrated or Vanity Fair or Cosmopolitan or wherever you are, a monthly, it's not about the month that just happened. It's about a worldview and stories that you may start, and they may take between 3 months and 2.5 years to finish. You've got to make sure that other people don't cover it to death by the time you come out, and that you think it's a story that will have some currency 3 months after you came up with the idea. A weekly and there's no closing schedule with a monthly. I never knew what I was supposed to do on any given day. It was really well managed, but not by me. But a weekly, I know exactly what I have to do on Tuesday. I know what I have to do on Monday, what I have to do on Wednesday, and there's something quite orderly about this, and it's given me better precision in my life.
Well, the other difference too is that Airmail is digital only, Vanity Fair is print. Is Airmail the future of magazines? Will there be any print publications in 10 years?
I think it is the way forward. I think that magazines will be around forever, but I can imagine going to a magazine news shop in New York. There are no newsstands left in New York. They're basically gone. There used to be one in every single office building had a newsstand. Now, they sell lotto tickets and flip-flops and chewing gum. And the building we were in, the One World Trade Center that Condé Nast moved to, it didn't have a newsstand at all. And the only tenant was a magazine company. So the fact is, the digital weekly, it's brilliant because it's like home delivery. You press a button, it goes around the world. We don't have truckers, we don't have printers. We can do something fast, we can do something slow, and you can design it beautifully, and we do it with like 35 staff members. But we still, Airmail is put together like Vanity Fair. Half the staff is from Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair level fact checking, copy editing, photo research, and all of that. So it's sort of old-fashioned values, but new-fashioned delivery system. Other than that, it could easily be printed, but I would never, ever print something on a weekly or monthly basis again, myself.
Who's the most interesting celebrity? Doesn't have to be a movie star, but just who's the most interesting person that we would all know that you've ever been associated with?
The one person who became a friend of mine was Artie Shaw, who was the greatest clarinetist in the world in the 1930s and 40s. And I met him when he was in his 80s. He lived to be almost 100. But actually, it's funny. I asked the same question. I did the introduction for a book on the Hotel de Cap, and I asked the staff who was their favorite guest, and every single person said the same thing: Robert De Niro. And that'd be my response as well. I think Bob De Niro is one of the more interesting, finest people I've ever met vis-a-vis the job.
Has being Canadian had any influence, positive or negative, or point of difference in your career and how you approached being an editor?
Well, it's funny. Most of the editors in New York, and I can only speak for editors, have come from outside of New York. There are very few locally born New York editors of note. And I think that Canada is in a unique position because you're sort of right up against the United States. And I know when I was growing up, you'd sort of Canadians be looking at the window. The Americans look like they're always having more fun. They had, slimmer waistlines and all the rest of it. And we were up there, and it was colder in Canada, and it was more conservative, and we had hockey. And I think that for the first part of your career, I think it's really good to be an outsider. First of all, you're less worried about bridges that may or may not need to be burned, and you know enough, but you don't know everything, so you're still a sponge. Also, I think people generally like Canadians. I think it's a safe haven for a lot of people, and I think growing up in Canada, I think it gave me sort of great values. I'm still best friends with two of my oldest friends from Canada, one of whom we've been friends for 65 years. Canadians don't screw people over. They're competitive, but they're not ruthless, is my experience. And I know all the Canadians I know in America who have done well are really fine people.
Well, I was going to ask you the question that I ask all my guests, but you basically answered it. I'm still going to throw it out there, though. What does being Canadian mean to you, assuming that you still feel very much Canadian after living over half your life in the United States?
The way it comes down, okay, it comes down to this. You're watching the Olympics, and it comes down to an American sprinter and a Canadian sprinter, and who do you root for? And I root for the Canadian one. And my wife, she gets so tired of this because we'll be watching a movie and I'll just go, Canadian, Canadian. And she said, how do you know? I said, I can tell. Either I remember them from childhood or from before, but I can tell a Canadian show by the lighting. I can tell a Canadian show by the sound quality. Nothing made me happier in the last 2 or 3 years, TV-wise, than Schitt's Creek doing so well. I mean, Catherine Hare is a friend of mine, and just to see those people create that thing, I watched it from the very first episode, and I just prayed that it would catch on, and it did.
Well, like the stars of Schitt's Creek, you have had a remarkable career, and I'm sure that all our viewers will join me in wishing you all the best with Airmail. Graydon, thanks so much for joining us on Canada Files.
Jim, great pleasure, and thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us. We hope you'll join us again on the next edition.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Richard and Gail McGraw, the 63 Foundation, as well as the following donors: the Browning Watt Foundation, Nona MacDonald Heaslip, Joe and Marie Heffernan, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Donna and Richard Ivey, Alice and Ted Kernahan, the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, the North Pine Foundation, Eleanor and Francis Shen, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, in memory of Peter A. Deeks, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.